We are live, sir.
Buddhi, over to you, please.
Very good evening. I would like to welcome Professor Rajkumar, Honorable Vice Chancellor of Jindal Global University, for this session on book discussions. We have our distinguished author, Professor Michael Davis, who is a professor of law in JGLS, Jindal Global Law School, and also professor of law in the University of Hong Kong. We also have a distinguished panel for discussants consisting of Professor Sriram Cholia, Dean of Jindal School of International Affairs, and Professor Avinash Godbole, Professor in Jindal School of Human Region Liberal Arts and Humanities. So first of all, I would like to invite Professor Rajkumar to deliver his opening remarks for the session, followed by discussion on the book by Professor Davis. Professor Rajkumar.
All right. Well, very, very good evening to all of you in India, and of course, good morning and good to others in different parts of the world. It's a very special moment for us at OP Jindal Global University and Jindal Global Law School to host this book discussion on what promises to be a fascinating book. I must confess that I have not read the book entitled Making Hong Kong China, the Rollback of Human Rights and the Rule of Law. Of course, I have had the privilege to be a very dear friend, but also a mentee of Professor Michael Davis, who is a very distinguished scholar in the field of human rights and international law, but also currently a colleague of mine at Jindal Global Law School. In many ways, this book published by the Columbia University Press has captured the extraordinary imagination and the struggles of the people of Hong Kong for a very long time when it comes to not so much about asserting a very expansive idea of human rights, but honestly a more, I would say, limited conception of human rights and rule of law. Now, I say this with the full sense of responsibility, having lived and worked in Hong Kong for many years, having written about issues relating to human rights and rule of law and access to justice in Hong Kong, having looked at issues relating to human rights across the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. So in a way, the work of the author, Professor Michael Davis, who has so steadfastly and in many ways with integrity and rectitude, espousing the cause of human rights in Hong Kong for a very long time. This is a culmination of that effort. He has worked extensively as a public intellectual, as an academic, as a distinguished scholar, and also as somebody who has shaped the human rights movement in Hong Kong. And I think it is only fair to say that generations of young human rights scholars, as well as human rights activists, human rights practitioners, even constitutional law, lawyers, constitutional lawyers in Hong Kong have been inspired by the work of Michael Davis as a teacher, as a researcher, as a scholar, as a public intellectual, and as an author. So I am very delighted that Professor Michael Davis, who is currently, of course, Professor of Law and International Affairs at the Jindal Global Law School, has authored this book. Now, of course, little did Michael predicted that this book will be released at the time of the global pandemic, but more importantly, when the entire, issue surrounding human rights would have reached such alarming proportions when it comes to Hong Kong, but more importantly, even global conversations and even concerns expressed with regard to China itself, and to have a provocative title, Making Hong Kong China, almost reminds me of Dworkin's book title, Taking Right Seriously. So in many ways, this book argues to what extent this current struggles that the people of Hong Kong are going through, have gone through, to what extent it is radically reimagining what was promised to be one country, two systems in Hong Kong, what was promised to be Hong Kong's commitment towards rule of law and an independent judiciary and constitutional, governance, what was promised to be independent institutions which will have a strong human rights framework, what was promised to have a vibrant civil society culture that will protect rights and freedoms, and also what was promised to be an independent and free and independent press. Is this the evolution of a broken promise? To what extent Chinese attempts to engage and intervene and even arguably reimagine the vision of Hong Kong, particularly since the handover? What are its larger implications when it comes to enforcement of human rights and protection of the rule of law? So it's I am very, very eager to read the book, but also to hear Michael's reflections on the book itself. I also want to say that this one of the big challenges of looking at Hong Kong and then looking at China and then also looking at the world is also about the unique position of Hong Kong in the larger context of China, but also in the world itself. While Hong Kong is not a country on its own, it is a unique city, but then it has a lot of unique features that actually promises to a model, and what could have been a unique model is unfortunately gradually being undermined, and that is part of the larger narrative that the book I believe will establish. It's also important for us to recognize, particularly when we see the transition of government in the United States, to what extent global leaders are conscious about the need for protection of human rights, to what extent they are prepared to listen to the voice of the people. The Hong Kong example in many ways should serve as a microcosm of the role of elected leaders also in different parts of the world, and how they are supposed to be held accountable for their promises, but also more importantly for their own actions. So congratulations, Mike, for the book. And I look forward to reading the book, but more importantly, for also hearing your reflections today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Thank you so much. I think Professor Rajkumar has laid the broader context for Professor Michael Davis's book. So let's hear from the horse's mouth. The one and only Michael Davis. We cannot think of another person who is an American, but essentially a Hong Konger. And we cannot think of another person who has given his life for the cause of Hong Kong, but also studied it and mentored generations of Hong Kong students. So the book which we'll discuss captures a lot of the his own personal journey, going back to the 1980s, 35 years or longer, and brings it up to the contemporary. But let's hear it from him first, what he thinks are the most salient points of his book, why he wrote this, and what is his message. Over to you, Michael.
Oh, thank you, Sriram and Raj. Raj, you saved me a lot of trouble explaining what Hong Kong is and why we're worried about this. That you, I think, laid out beautifully these promises that were made to Hong Kong. And I think when we look at it, one of the things that struck me, and I start the book with this, I for the non-Hong Kong reader, I kind of mentioned that Hong Kong is like New York or London. It's one of these global cities. In a way, we all have an interest in these cities because our economic life, our cultural life, the universe as we know it sort of passes through these corridors of these cities. And Hong Kong is one of those cities in Asia. The others I compare it to in starting the book was London and New York. So I think that means, I hope, grabs our attention, that if Hong Kong is under threat, this is an extraordinary thing. It's not just 7.5 million people, which is itself a major concern, but it's also this global city, this special place. And I think Raj pointed out exactly the promises that were made. I think that when I look at it, the listeners may not know that Hong Kong was turned over under Sino-British Joint Declaration. And the Joint Declaration is a treaty. It was registered with the UN. It's between China and Britain. And it stipulated a basic law would be enacted, and it stipulated the content of the basic law. So we can kind of jump past some of that, and we can see that, in my view, and I point this out in the second chapter where I ask whether the basic law is a solemn promise or a ruse. You know, is it serious? Is it something to be taken seriously? And I think Hong Kong people took it very seriously, and a lot of people around the world that think of themselves as Hong Kongers and Hong Kong supporters also took it seriously. But I think there were two flaws built into the problem. And I think this is important for people studying autonomy. And those two flaws essentially gave the central government total control over what happened in Hong Kong. An autonomy arrangement that doesn't secure that autonomy is a perilous path to go on, okay? And so what the basic law did, it had all these promises, really of a liberal constitution, as Raj so nicely described it. So that was very important. But what Beijing did is it put two hedges in there that I think are the source of every protest on the street of Hong Kong. One is it gave itself totally the ultimate power to interpret the basic law. Now, I had written a book way back in 1990 where I recommended the creation of either a basic law committee or a constitutional court of some sort, where I suggested, in the sort of Austrian tradition of constitutional review, that there be members from Hong Kong and the mainland on this committee, and that the committee could resolve disputes between the central government and the local autonomous region. China adopted the idea of a basic law committee, but then they rendered it powerless, okay? So what they did is they said that now the basic law committee, which does have Hong Kongers on it and mainlanders, they said that it would be consulted when the National People's Congress Standing Committee, a political body, interpreted the basic law. The consultations are completely behind closed doors. No one knows whether they're listened to, the committee's listened to it at all. So this interpretation power is one thing that kind of put the Hong Kong autonomy at risk. And very early on, a case where the court, that according to the basic law, that only when it involved local central relations with central authority, the Court of Final Appeal would refer the matter to the central people's government, to the National People's Congress. But very early on, in the very first case, the court refused to do so, and the government ran around them. So the die was cast that whenever there's a sensitive case in Hong Kong, there was always a threat that Beijing would interfere. The second area was they promised the ultimate aim was universal suffrage in Hong Kong. But Beijing, in the basic law, it says the local government could, the legislature and so on, could establish fully elected democratic legislature in Hong Kong and just report it to the National People's Congress for the record. Beijing in 2004 interjected an interpretation that said you had to go to Beijing before you could even start the process. Now, so all of this, these two elements are present, and I discuss them in the book. And going forward, Hong Kong people then watch their government and they look at it and they said, is this government going to defend our autonomy? And the people of Hong Kong are very astute. They know that the rule of law in Hong Kong, the very core value that Hong Kong depends on, what distinguishes Hong Kong from the mainland, the rule of law depends on Hong Kong's autonomy. So that's the sort of core political problem. And what they found is because the government now in place is selected by an election committee, which is dominated by Beijing, the chief executive of Hong Kong essentially is elected by Beijing under this model, that this official would never defend Hong Kong's autonomy. Rather, the official keeps representing Beijing's concerns. So, well, you know, China has in its DNA this kind of need to control everything. So over the years, it really didn't know how to run an open society. And over the years, it interferes in Hong Kong whenever it thinks it's expedient. And what Hong Kong people would look for, does the Hong Kong government push back against this? They don't expect the government to go to war against Beijing, but they expect it to have a voice, to at least speak out and maybe help Beijing to understand how this open society works. That was never done. And so when Hong Kong people take to the street in 2003, I was part of a group of people that organized a protest against proposed national security laws. And the people, we sat in a room, wrote a bunch of pamphlets, constructed arguments why a proposal that the government was making was violating the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, was violating basic freedoms. And to our surprise, 500,000 protesters followed us to the street, and we actually got the government to back down, and that law was not enacted. Of course, we know this year China imposed a national security law on Hong Kong. But anyhow, that was one case. So the people realized that this imposition, this thing that Beijing wanted the government to do, the only way to stop it was to go to the street, that they could not count on the government of Hong Kong to say, no, this maybe not the right thing to do. We already have these sorts of laws from the British colonial period. Maybe we just lay low on this. So that kind of pushback never occurs. So what happens then in 2012, the Beijing's encouraging the Hong Kong government to enact laws that provide for patriotic education in Hong Kong, national education. This is when a new generation of youthful protesters come on the scene, saying they don't want to be brainwashed. And again, the people of Hong Kong are watching and they're joining and supporting these protests because they don't see the government doing it. And so one of the things that comes out of all of this, and there are protests in 2004, 2014 and 15, and then finally last year, is that people realize that unless the government, the promise of universal suffrage is kept, then Hong Kong's autonomy will be lost. And so in every one of these protests over democracy is this deep concern that Hong Kong's autonomy is at risk from one of the most authoritarian regimes in the world. And that the only way of guarding it so far has been taking to the street, but the way to guard it and secure it over the long haul would be to have the political reform that's promised in the basic law. So in 2019, last year, we see again a whole massive protest. The world all watched, right? 1 million, then 2 million people took to the streets in a city of 7 million. And what we saw then is the police start taking very heavy-handed methods of trying to suppress the protest. And so instead of reacting to the demands, what had happened is the Hong Kong government had proposed extradition laws so that Hong Kongers could be sent off to the mainland to be tried on mainland charges. And of course, this profoundly threatens the kind of rule of law-based autonomy that Hong Kong has. So people took to the streets and protested against it. The government wouldn't listen. Again, the government, obviously beholden to Beijing, was not listening to Hong Kong people. So this again posed a problem for Hong Kong and the massive protest. And then the protesters started taking more aggressive measures. They started throwing rocks. They invaded the Legislative Council. I remember when things like that happened around New Delhi in the past as well, where protesters or fights go on in the legislative body. So all of these things. And when the protesters took over the Legislative Council, one of them put a poster on the wall saying, "You taught us that nonviolence doesn't work." So we see this kind of increasing violence, but most of all, the people are seeing violence from the police. The police are using very heavy-handed tactics. And so then Beijing is watching all of this, and everyone's expecting the People's Liberation Army to come rolling into town. But what happens instead is, instead of listening to the people's concerns, again and again, ignoring what the people are concerned about, failing to convey it to Beijing, instead of doing that, the government just turns the problem over to the police and tells them, in effect, to repress these protests, which they set about doing very aggressively. And so then when we get to the pandemic arising, the protests start dying down because no one wants to, there's social distancing going on. So there is some reluctance to go to the street and protest. And then there's a several month period where Hong Kong government and Beijing could have listened, could have thought about what to do. Instead, they started arresting people and prosecuting the protesters. And very prominent protesters that everyone knows around the world actually are sent off to jail. And so it starts looking like a police state. And then if that weren't enough, this year, finally, a national security law is imposed by Beijing. And this time, Beijing is effectively coming directly into Hong Kong and taking over. It doesn't consult the people about this national security law, even though China's own laws require it. It doesn't consult either the mainlanders or Hong Kongers. The chief executive of Hong Kong only sees this law on June 30th, when it's actually promulgated in Hong Kong, directly from the mainland. And this national security law is above all local laws on its face. It says so. And quite frankly, and I argue in the book, that it amends the basic law and transforms Hong Kong into this national security state, if you will, a national security constitution. And the law is very heavy-handed on all the areas of rule of law. First, it's enacted without consulting the people. Then they set up a committee under the chief executive that's advised by a mainland official. And this so-called national security advisor is the head of the local liaison office, Beijing's office in Hong Kong. And this committee that's to control national security, which includes the chief executive and several officials, is answerable to the Central People's Government directly. And so the central government is taking a direct control over national security issues in Hong Kong. Under this law, this committee is not subject to judicial review. It's beyond judicial review. It doesn't stop there. Then they create an office of the Central People's Government. And this is staffed totally by mainland public security people. And it is not even subject to local jurisdiction. And they create special branches in the police department, special branches in the Justice Department. And these special branches are to operate in secret. So you have a secret police enforcing these 4 laws against secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion. And these 4 crimes are loosely defined, any kind of incitement, whatever. All of this is going on. And this central office from the central government can even take people across the border to try them in mainland China. The law provides for only a special list of judges to hear these cases. So it checks all the boxes. My good friend Jerry Cohen, a very prominent China scholar, said, boy, he's shocked at how thorough they are at creating layer after layer of ways to control Hong Kong directly. And so mainland officials now routinely interfere in Hong Kong affairs. And these cases that are taken to the court, Hong Kong, many of the cases are before the law is enacted. They're from last year's protest, the so-called public order branch of this problem. Well, these cases now are kind of married with the national security cases. So if a judge dismisses the case because the police have no evidence that the person engaged in rioting or whatever he's accused of, then mainland officials attack the judge. And these judges are attacked by pro-Beijing figures in Hong Kong. So the judiciary is under onslaught. At the same time, they started vetting people. Only people approved by the government can run for the Legislative Council. And so it kind of looks like the Guardian Council in Iran, the way these politicians are vetted. If they oppose the national security law, then they are excluded from running. Recently, 4 legislators were directly kicked out of the Legislative Council by the central government, by a decree from the central government, because these 4 had opposed the national security law. I'm just giving a kind of trail of things that are going on. A journalist, the most prominent newspaper in Hong Kong, the Apple Daily, the head of it was arrested under the national security law because he promotes democracy around the world. And his newspaper offices were invaded by over 200 police. So what we see are these sort of authoritarian tactics that are very at odds with this very open society. Hong Kong has been ranked among the freest societies in the world in the past. So we're seeing a very dramatic transformation from this promised liberal constitutional system one that was being kind of intruded drip by drip, to now a sudden dramatic change to a national security model. And this is occurring during the pandemic, when everybody's attention is distracted by that. At the same time, of course, China's doing other things. It's having problems on the Indian border, in the South China Sea, and so on. So this intrusion in Hong Kong is viewed around the world with considerable concern. And I have a chapter talking about the international response to this. The United States has passed laws on it and now has withdrawn its recognition of Hong Kong's special status. A thing that I didn't point out at the beginning that's very important is China invited countries around the world to treat Hong Kong distinctly from the mainland. So when Chinese officials now complain that foreign officials are criticizing its Hong Kong policy, it's a little bit rich to think about that, when in fact their presence in Hong Kong and their relationship with Hong Kong is a result of China's invitation to treat Hong Kong separately in reliance on the basic law of Hong Kong and the Sino-British Treaty. So this is the kind of contentious environment that exists. This is what causes a lot of fear. In the book, I emphasize the evolution from hope to fear in Hong Kong. And I think this is the source of the problem. Well, I'll stop talking now. We could go on a great length on this, and I encourage people to have a look at the book, but I would like to hear from my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Michael Davis. Indeed, eye-opener for a lot of people around the world. While we have been following the news about the protests and the clashes on the streets and such things, I think the in-depth understanding of this cycle of suppression and revolt that you have shown in the book is, I think, a major addition to the literature, and I'm sure it will be cited in times to come. I've managed to read the whole thing. It's relatively a short work, around 115 pages, and not including references. So it's a very readable account. Professor Michael Davis has straddled the disciplines of law and political science very well. And what he's managed to do is give us a kind of concise history of this problem and of the tragedy that we are seeing with Hong Kong and how it has come about. And like he said in his remarks, the thing that I found most interesting about the book is, he's showing the steady drip by drip deterioration of the promised autonomy. And he goes back right to the creation of the basic law, the mini constitution of Hong Kong after it was handed over to China. And he shows how the provisions in it were, while they were largely created a lot of hope for Hong Kong people that they can have the best of both worlds. They're Chinese people culturally and civilizationally, they are Cantonese Chinese. But then they would have wanted to continue with the liberal Western freedoms that they had gotten under British rule after World War II. So what he shows in the book is that the Chinese obviously were always anxious about controlling Hong Kong, even during the relatively more liberal predecessors of Xi Jinping. But what they had at the time, and Professor Davis shows very intricately, is they had a way of managing and manipulating the local elites in Hong Kong and being behind the curtain and doing a kind of indirect, overseeing the whole one country, two systems models, but without trampling on the toes of, the people much in those early years. But what he shows is that step by step, because of the lack of understanding, at one point he calls it a clash of legal and political cultures between mainland and Hong Kong. And in that sense, the tragedy is inevitable because and he shows, and the point I like about the book is he shows that at no stage were Hong Kong protesters seeking, and even our vice chancellor mentioned it, seeking independence or secession. They had far lesser demands. They simply wanted this best of two worlds, as I put it, to carry on. But what happened was that, as Professor Davis says, it became more one country and less two systems over time. And this has to do, and he dwells a little bit, not very much, on the motivations for China to progressively become more and more possessive, insecure, and repressive about Hong Kong. So he does talk about various explanations. Possibly, definitely under Xi Jinping, there's no question that it's at a higher level, the level of direct control that they have now assumed with the national security law and all that. So I think it's helpful to understand the reasons for this fundamental clash, and I think those come out very well. The other point, of course, is the he makes a very important point, especially to me as a political scientist, that which appealed, was the weakness or even absence of credible and genuine intermediate institutions between the people of Hong Kong and the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. Uh, what would have ideally worked for one country, two systems was that the local Hong Kong chief executive, Hong Kong legislature, and Hong Kong courts, Hong Kong police, all the associations that make the civic life of Hong Kong, that they would have been relatively robust and would have transmitted the grievances and aspirations of the Hong Kong people, and had a dialogue with the top authorities in Beijing, and brought back significant restraint or concessions for people, for ordinary people, the 7 million people, to lead the best of, to have the best of the two worlds and to lead a good life. What he shows is that these intermediate institutions were never really allowed to take strong roots, and that has to do with the control freak mentality of the Communist Party of China, especially so under Xi Jinping, because they're tightening the noose each passing day and not allowing any of these intermediate institutions to function. I think that was an important point. And before I pass to Avinash, my colleague, I just want to mention one more point about the book, which is very interesting, which is Professor Davis's personal experiences. He's lived there for decades. He's taught generations of Hong Kong university students, has been involved in drafting major points of law for consideration, is close to the civil society in Hong Kong. And on the other hand, he is also, he mentions his role in helping the US Congress and mobilizing international support for the Hong Kong movement. Those of you who don't know, he has done the same thing for the people of Tibet as well over the years, and he's been associated with the Dalai Lama. So I think, and there are chapters in the book where he moves away from being this, clinical, legal / political scholar, to being actually a kind of like a participant, and he refers to the mood on the streets, the youth. Important contribution in the book is how the baton shifted from older generation of pro-democracy activists and proponents to a much younger, more radical youth movement that we see today. Teenagers and people in their 20s, risking their lives on the streets. So I think that transition also is shown, and he's shown one of the key arguments of the book, and I hope the readers will get it, is that at various stages it was possible for Beijing to have listened a little more empathetically, and that would have probably solved the problem at various stages. I mean, going back to 1997, the handover to the UK, or even before that, and then bringing it to the present times, last 25 years or so, is showing at different critical junctures, when there was a grievance, when people felt that they were being disenfranchised, or being that the freedoms they took for granted were being trampled. if Beijing has shown little more sagacity and wisdom in responding to these and understanding that Hong Kongers are different. So what is it? The mindset of the mainlander is always, I'll crack the whip and you fall in line, right? So that kind of mindset, when they apply it to a different set of people who have come up in a different way historically and culturally, it's very difficult. And so a little bit of moderation on the part of the Chinese authorities at different stages, he shows, could have actually pacified a lot of the anger and the unrest. But sadly, we are now at probably the stage where it's like a point of no return now. And he does recommend that the Hong Kong officials, the judges and the lawyers and the local bureaucrats and academia and all of them should continue to stand up for what is right and what is moral and what is legal. But but there is also a tone of desperation in his own conclusion that, this great world city has been lost now and it's not coming back, at least not until possibly until this kind of rule exists in Beijing. uh, but anyway, I'd like to just conclude by saying that I think it's worth reading to understand the complexities of the this whole this clash of legal and political cultures. And it's helpful. This book helps us to also go beyond the simplification, the oversimplifications that everybody knows that there is authoritarian China and that there are all these youth who want a freer life. But then he connects it to the historical currents and also to the roads not taken. See, the great books always talk about the road not taken and how at critical junctures maybe we could have come up with a happier ending than what we are seeing today. As to the future, he's kept it open. There is this fear of exodus of large numbers of people who will just leave the city and look for, maybe go to Taiwan, go to Western countries, and resettle there. And in a way, the people who fled the mainland, and he points it out, it's so poignant. The people who fled the mainland out of fear of persecution, many of them settled in Hong Kong over since 1949, and now the people of Hong Kong, fearing persecution, have to possibly flee and go elsewhere to avoid, the same fate. So where will they go, and what will happen to this? Can China assimilate Hong Kong the way it wants to by force and convert it in 20, 30 years into another Shanghai or Shenzhen with full patriotic values? This is the real question, and where I think Professor Davis shows is the difference. Of course, is that while they are culturally Chinese, he's saying that they will not easily give up, and the more repression there is, you will find. And he talks about the laws of motion in physics and politics, how for every action there will be a counter reaction. So it's far from over. Just because we are not hearing about mass protests for a few months doesn't mean that people are now resigned to their fate. I think the spirit of the people of Hong Kong has been well captured in the book. So if you read it, my hunch is that you're going to see now this cycle intensifying, and we will have to see what will happen with the new national security law. Can it simply cow these freedom-loving people into silence? These are the big questions. What will the world do? Professor Davis has mentioned, he's talked about democracies coming to the fore and supporting this, and possibly under a Joe Biden administration in the US, you will see more of this democracy and human rights based advocacy to support what's happening in Hong Kong. So I think we are in for a very, very long slog. It's not going to be easy, and it's in a sense, this is a very depressing book, because we know the tragedy and how it has been unfolding, roughly speaking. But in another sense, I think there are glimmers of hope here and there, and Maybe in 5 years' time, there will be a different, era altogether, and a different trajectory. Maybe I think the ideal thing, from Professor Michael Davis' point of view, or from the book's point of view, is if we turn back the clock to the Deng Xiaoping period, it was still okay. And until in the initial years of the handover, my sense is it was still okay. But how do we turn back the clock to that? I think unless there is a regime change in at the top echelons of the Chinese Communist Party, we may not see that. But anyway, that's my thoughts on the book. And over to you, Avinash. Your thoughts, please.
Hey, Avinash, before you say anything, I want to quickly react to Sriram and, of course, Michael as well. Mike, one of the big challenges that we are facing when we try to understand Hong Kong and China is that to what extent, let's say, a country which actually doesn't have the type of democratic system that other democracies have is expected to, let's say, approach governance in a place like Hong Kong, when fundamentally the values that shape and even govern a society like China is very different. Now, I want to juxtapose that to India in a way, because at the dawn of Indian independence in 1947, there were many parts of India which had a very strong tendency towards wanting to be separated from India. There were vociferous tendencies developing very strongly. I actually come from the state of Tamil Nadu. As late as 1960s, there were mainstream political parties in the state of Tamil Nadu, even some of them into the 70s, which would argue that we should be separated from India. In fact, there were, and some of them later became, serious politicians and became chief ministers, and pretty much became part of the electoral process and are governing. But then India, because of India's commitment towards democracy at that constitutional moment, India ended up creating accommodative imaginations where a lot of autonomy and freedom and independent governance, barring sovereignty, was created. And it worked in many parts of northeastern parts of India. It, of course, worked in southern parts of India. But barring, the then state of Jammu and Kashmir, most parts of India, I would say, we've been able to transition into a peaceful evolution of democratic governance with continuous efforts to create new states. And we have very recently also carved out states within previous states. So my question, and which I would like you to keep in mind, is this something that we all got it wrong? That China was never possibly prepared and ready for giving this sort of one country, two system model then, and it was almost inevitable that this is going to happen. And the real challenge and the only way by which we can save Hong Kong is to actually invest in democratizing China. That will ultimately lead for China to appreciate these type of accommodations and autonomous possibilities.
Raj, India, the great book I like about is Stephen Wan Lin's and Yadav, the book talking about India as a state nation. So this ethic of accommodation, of inclusion, what you're saying, in effect, China lacks. It achieves inclusion by control, repression. But in that context, Hong Kong was such an imaginative project that Deng Xiaoping came up with. Because in the world at large, we have lots of communities that are really uncomfortable in their national setting. And yet our international law doesn't really provide security for autonomous communities. So most of the wars since World War II are people fighting for liberation or independence because an intermediate option is not available. So what was the imagination of this Hong Kong model was to create an intermediate option where a community could be inside another country where its traditions and institutions were not perhaps comfortable, or where it was at odds with that, and yet be accommodated. And I thought the invention wasn't bad. And you and I were there watching this in the early, co-authored something. It was an article over SARS instead of the current pandemic. It seems things go around and repeat themselves. But in any case, I think that imaginative model offered a lot of hope, but it required things now that we can see we're missing. And that is a willing to, in a state committed to controlling everything, willing to let an open society function on its own model. And that model was very nicely written into the basic law. But the political will to carry it out seemed to be lacking. I don't want to go on any further about it, but I think it is a problem. I mean, we see in Jammu and Kashmir in India similar kinds of debates about how these kinds of little distinctive communities can survive in a larger community. And it's something that we need to address globally and not just locally, because it happens in many parts of the world. Now, I have a very tight schedule because I have to go to something afterwards I've mentioned to everyone. So I want to give my colleagues a chance to speak. Please go ahead.
Avinash, please.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Avinash, to take your time.
No, not at all. Actually, you said a good context to what I was about to say. I'll be speaking for a very brief bit. So now, the way we understand it, it's one country, two systems, and one interpretation. And in retrospect, it's clear that China was simply buying time, even in case of Hong Kong, until it could actually have enough power of its own. And as you have beautifully highlighted in the book, the timeline of events, this single interpretation of the one country, two systems is actually getting stronger. And the epitome of that is the national security law. We did actually a simulation in about 2013 on the possibilities and futures of Hong Kong and Taiwan. It was imagined in an opposite way of how the Hong Kong democracy or Taiwanese potential peaceful merger, so to speak, could destabilize the political regime in China. But exactly the opposite of that is something that is being imagined by China, being prepared for, and being worked on through the national security legislation. As we know, in the basic law, there were only two possibilities for the mainland's intervention into Hong Kong: foreign affairs and national security. And the national security was the easier, the simpler route that they have taken. This discussion today couldn't also have come at a better time. Last Thursday, we saw the Minister of Foreign Affairs, China, give a very strong and kind of a crazy comment on this Five Eyes alliance, intelligence alliance, that their comment on Hong Kong, that regardless of whether they have 5 eyes or 10, if they dare to harm China's national interest, then they should be wary of those eyes being poked blind. And I have been following the MOFA for a while now, and I find this perhaps the most strongest and also the most aggressively worded statement of this nature coming from there. Quite often I'm reminded of the work that Susan Shirk did in China, the fragile superpower, and there the stability and the search for stability is mentioned again and again. Now, why does this massive party feels so insecure about a tiny island and its people having a destabilizing impact on its own regime and on its own people? I think a lot of it has to do with their relations with their own people and the way that legitimacy is driven, the performance legitimacy, as we understand in case of the Chinese Communist Party. The cracks for that can be happening only on the basis of representation, and Hong Kong was one of the roots. I have been actually reading on Hong Kong right from my student days, but the most significant first thing I noticed was the education, nationalist education program, and right from the appointment of C.Y. Leung's in 2012, how that shaped and the protests. this younger generation that you talk of, the kids who were born in 1990s and afterwards, that's a very curious generation, and they will be the ones ultimately leading the protest against the party, Communist Party, into the future. Now the book is wonderful. I must confess that I have not finished reading it entirely, but you have highlighted every aspect of how the changes happen in Hong Kong. And like Sriram mentioned, your personal touches also add value to it. So the society of Hong Kong, the academia, the publishing industry, the newspapers, the legal professional infrastructure, as well as the lawyers, the local culture, media, business, and the foreign engagement, all of these are highlighted fantastically well. China's strength in strangling Hong Kong also comes from the rise of Shenzhen and Shanghai as alternative centers. Shenzhen as a center of industry and Shanghai as a center of finance. And I followed this very closely, this last visit by Xi Jinping to Shenzhen. I mean, something that happened after the Beidaihe meeting this year, where he announced the next set of reforms, trying to recapture the reforms that he has been talking of right since 2013, but not being able to implement in greater detail. And you saw that along with him, present in Shenzhen were also the Hong Kong representatives in various functions. And I thought that was curious. Trying to posture Shenzhen as the center of the next generation of industrial revolution in China, and the process of submerging Hong Kong within that is something that will be strengthening in the future as well. My second last point is that the Chinese Communist Party is a process, and I mean, you have highlighted that beautifully in your book. They have moved from popular nationalism to procedural legal nationalism within their own country. The way the changes of law, the possibility of constitutionalism, etc., came up. They want to control that form of nationalism where people can come on the street and protest even against foreigners. I mean, you don't see anymore the protests like what we saw outside the Japanese embassy a decade and a half or a decade ago. I mean, on those couple of occasions, or those protests on the Yasukuni shrine visits. But this is more of a legal, structural nationalism and the centralization of process. And, to what extent it will go, that remains to be seen. And Hong Kong is actually a very curious case. I mentioned this to you before, but there's a very clear organic connection between Hong Kong and Taiwan. I mean, the one country, two system was often being discussed as being a model for Taiwan. And what happens in Taiwan next is also important, because since September, there's also ultra right-wing element in the Taiwanese leadership within KMT, within DPP as well. And they have been bringing out legislations that want to reduce their connections with China even further. Those legislations might go ahead, might not, but then it shows the mood of how it's happening in case of Taiwan. And there's an element of media writing which speculates that in the second election of President Tsai, the way Hong Kong developments have shaped might have played a role in influencing the Taiwanese voters. I would like to hear your opinion on that. I mean, she has won with a significant majority this time. So once again, congratulations on your book, and thank you for inviting me. I'm definitely getting a copy for my library, and I look forward to meeting you whenever COVID allows and the vaccine allows. And thanks for inviting me once again.
Thank you, Avinash. Thank you. Very pertinent points. Michael, before you respond and we close, I'd like you to just segue to what Avinash just said. At some points in the book, you talk about the growth of a distinct Hong Kong identity. And you spoke about this new anthem, Glory to Hong Kong. And a sense that at least some of the younger Hong Kongers now increasingly do not believe that they are Chinese. And we have seen a similar evolution in Taiwan, right? Like now I think 70% or more of the Taiwanese public do not consider themselves Chinese anymore. But that is, they have not even experienced the kind of repression that Hong Kongers are doing, because they were always shielded from it as a self-governing island. So do you see that also coming in now? I mean, more of the independence type thinking, because now people have no, like you said, there's no democratic or institutional way to resolve the frustration. So will it actually, you say it's not a revolution because people want status quo and to retain the freedoms that they had about 25 years ago. But on the other hand, could we go in a revolutionary direction, and is a separate Hong Kong identity now inevitable, or can the Chinese, through their the brainwashing, as you call it, or the patriotic education, if not this generation, over time they will slowly soften it and absorb and assimilate Hong Kongers? Over to you, Michael, for your concluding comment.
Yeah, this is a core question. I always like to remember when I first arrived in Hong Kong, my very first class, I asked the students, it was 1985, it was right after the Sino-British treaty was signed. I asked the students, what would you do if you had a choice about Hong Kong's future? And first, the students in this university class refused my question. They said, no one asked us. Only the British and the Chinese got together and did this. They didn't consult us. Our opinion doesn't matter. So I asked them to humor me. And the answer they came up with was stunning. That the class, all except one student, who's now a colleague professor at Hong Kong U, all except one student said they would have Hong Kong return to China and then hire the British to run it. And so this is a very stunning position, because it shows that they have, at this point in time, now we're talking about the parent generation of the youth we see on the street, that they had a sense of identity with China, but they didn't trust the Chinese government, the way China governs. They had greater respect for the British way of governing. So the best, you say the best of both worlds. Well, the best of both worlds is to have them both. But then as time goes on, I think this sense of attachment to the mainland was literally destroyed by the mainland's own policies. It's their own behavior that's bringing this initial feeling of good feeling for China is being lost, because there's a kind of heavy-handed approach that's being taken. It's not one of consulting and listening and how do we fit in and inviting this kind of, Raj made this point about state nation, this idea that the way India approached its diverse populations, not all of them successfully, there was partition, but at least many of them. That sense was not there. It was always a kind of a big brother, do what we say. When I was doing interviews last December, I interviewed one of the prominent politicians who had also been my colleague in the Article 23 concern group of years ago. And he said, well, you can wash their brains at school, but when they go home, they'll hear something different. And I think this is the challenge of any government that wants to force people to love it, to be patriotic, that it tends to produce the opposite effect. And that's why Sriram made the point in his comments, that you made this point, that there were many junctures where they could handle it in a way where they would have won the hearts and minds of Hong Kong people. But in each case, they seem to turn in the opposite direction. We have a hard time explaining this kind of heavy-handed approach, but apparently it's built into the political DNA of the Communist Party. So when people don't do what you want, you force them to do it. And this kind of governance doesn't work very well in an open society. A society that's been ranked among the freest in the world, literally, by those who do these rankings. This kind of approach has the opposite effect in every case. And so is there a way to back down from this? I mean, the Taiwan problem, the one country, two systems model wasn't originally designed for Hong Kong. It was designed for Taiwan. It was going to be a tool to recover Taiwan. Now, there's even a history to that that's, I think, worth mentioning. Many people believe that China's thinking, Deng Xiaoping's thinking on this came from a much earlier policy, the so-called 17-point agreement over Tibet, when China reached an agreement with the Dalai Lama to allow, to accept Chinese sovereignty, but let Tibet run its own affairs in a traditional way. So this model, this 17-point agreement that was reached, which failed for the same reason. In those days, there was a new communist regime that was perhaps pretty full of itself and feeling very passionate about its new system, really repressed the Tibetans' self-government, repressed the Tibetans' own autonomy. So that was there. And then fast forward, this idea in the 1982 Constitution under Article 31 that we would have this one country, two systems model for Taiwan. Taiwan wasn't interested. It was becoming democratized at the time. And so they used it in Hong Kong. A further footnote is quite interesting. When I have met with Tibetan exile officials, they have actually proposed to China at various times that this one country, two systems model would work for Tibet. So it's what goes around comes around. It started with Tibet and it winds up targeting Taiwan, gets used in Hong Kong, and now of course, China says, well, no, we won't use it with Tibet because this model is designed to recover sovereignty. If we already have it, then we don't use this model. So this is kind of the structural context of this one country, two systems idea. But in spite of its birth and how it was invented, I thought it was a very inventive model. I think most people did. If they actually carried it out, I think it might have worked. And it would have been a lesson for the world on how to deal with these kinds of problems, because these problems exist in many countries. It's need for an autonomy model. So
Mike,
I think
one question as you end this thing. I know you have to rush, but I couldn't help ask this question. What is your, let's say, message for leaders around the world? Because this book has been published and we're having this book talk at a time when one of the oldest and arguably well-established, rather stable, predictable democracy has gone through an extremely difficult phase in its time when public commentators like Thomas Friedman and Farid Zakaria have talked about a coup type situation prevailing in the United States, an elected government not allowed to have a smooth transition of power, something unthinkable in established democracies is taking place. And then you have, societies like China, which is not a democracy, where the idea of not hearing people's voices is reflected in the situation in Hong Kong. And then there are people who are watching around the world who seem to think that this might just be one of these models could just work so long as there could be assertion of power. So my question to you is that, what is the message that you will have for political leaders around the world when it comes to future of constitutional governance and democracy?
Well, I think there are a number of lessons. One is that if you use this China model, and there is a global debate all over the Journal of Democracy about China's the decline of democracy and China's model being offered as an alternative. Beijing claims it's not doing that, and so on. But at the end of the day, what we see in Xinjiang, what we see in Hong Kong, what we see in the countries surrounding China is that when you use that model to rule, you get pushback. And while they can control a situation when they have absolute control, they may create the very conditions. The book outlines how they created the conditions of rebellion in Hong Kong by using this model. So to imagine, well, we know democracy is messy, always messy. I think Churchill said it was the least bad form of bad government. But while it's messy, it's not that authoritarian model like China's is less messy. in some ways, it just kicks the problem down the road to where people will rebel eventually unless the regime can be absolute in its control. So the lesson I get from China is that it keeps having to increase control. That's Xi Jinping. It keeps having to use more and more tools of repression to keep in place. I think the lesson from the US actually is that those liberal institutions that we care about really matter. I think Americans are, and the world is getting an education that when a populist leader acts with disregard for those liberal institutions and basically does whatever he wants to do, that this also blows up in your face. And the benefit of an open society is that you have a press who's going to be all too happy to rub it in your face. So, I mean, Trump faced that. Now, there's a side lesson that I don't think we've come up with an answer for, and that this idea on the social media of select consumption of information, and so that people in each political camp only listen to others in their camp and vilify others. That, I mean, Trump was like the poster child for that kind of approach. We haven't come up with a way how our democracies are going to live. I think our democracies are going to survive. I think, in fact, I'm trying to write a book now on why democracies succeed. That's my current project. But I think democracies are going to succeed. They're going to survive. But we have some really new challenges that we couldn't have imagined before the age of social media on how we generate intelligent information and evaluate it and spread it in a way so that people aren't living in these informational bubbles. I think this is part of the explanation of why Trump was so successful. I mean, we have other successful populist leaders around the world as well. He was so successful that the people that listen to him don't listen to the criticisms that are rightly directed at him. And so you have a polarization of society. I mean, India has some of it as well. I think that the gap between the BJP and the Congress in India reflects not as stark a polarization as we have seen under Trump, but it is in some sense a kind of polarization between the Congress model of governance, that one you described earlier, Raj, and I used Yadav's term, state nation, to describe a contrast between that and in a movement for Hindu nationalism, some other alternative also taking part of the public space. So how that gets sorted out in India, in the United States, in the Philippines, in Hungary, in Poland, in Europe, all of that is what the challenge of democracy today. But my answer, I think some good old tools are still there and they have to be shaped for this era. And those are those liberal institutions that we learn about.
Great. Thank you, Professor Michael Davis. We are out of time. I hope all of you will get to read this book in the audience. I want to draw your attention to a very dramatic sentence in the book towards the later part when he's talking about the national security legislation and the deeming of any one in being involved in promoting democracy and human rights in Hong Kong being labeled as in collusion with foreigners. And he says, Professor Michael Davis says, am I committing a crime by writing this book? I think that's, and to me, that's like the standout line of the book, because it captures the current agony and the anguish of the people of Hong Kong and their supporters. Because frankly, if they go, I mean, they could go after Michael Davis on the pretext that he wrote this book because it's an incitement to subversion or to opposition to state power or to China's national security. So, but, well, there is the wider world. This book will be read and celebrated, and it is in quite the antithesis of a crime. I think he has done a service to all of us, and making Hong Kong China is still work in progress. It's not complete yet. The title doesn't say that China has already remade Hong Kong. So the struggle is on, and let's see what happens. But the rest of the world matters, And I think that's the important additional point from Professor Michael Davis's book. Thank you, everyone. I want to request the library director to kindly close this. The Jindal Global University Library holds these events to enlighten our students and the university community and the wider public about books being authored by our own distinguished professors and researchers. So I request Buddhi to kindly do
So
the
the
closing
idea
remarks.
of the book talks or the book discussion was to have a more close and intensive discussion on a particular book, authored by people, in a small audience rather than a very big audience. So it has been an absolute pleasure, by listening to Professor Davis about the subject on Hong Kong and the rule of law and human rights there. Professor Rajkumar, thank you very much for gracing the occasion. Professor Cholia and Professor Godpale for your valuable remarks. I'm also thankful to all my colleagues who organized this event, and assisted me in successful IT people. They have done a good job. And I hope, everybody else who has been watching the proceedings on YouTube live must have felt that this has been a very valuable experience, a learning experience for all of them. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And with this, we come to close this session. Thank you so much.
Well, congratulations, Mike, and congratulations to Victoria and your children and all of them for contributing to this effort. Thank you.
Yeah, Raj, and we should talk sometime. Very good.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Avinash. Thank you, Buddhi.